"Take him away." The official's voice cracked like a whip across the courtyard. The royal guard stood frozen, his red uniform immaculate, his eyes forward, but his heart trembling. And just as the silence grew heavy with judgment, a small voice echoed through the hall. "No one touches him." "That's an order." Every head turned. There she stood, Princess Charlotte, crown slightly crooked, eyes blazing like the morning sun through storm clouds. She was just a child, yet somehow, her voice carried the weight of generations. The courtyard outside Buckingham Palace was a scene of cold ceremony that morning. The air smelled of polished brass and old secrets. Guards stood in perfect formation, tourists murmured behind iron fences, and yet, something was off. A storm was brewing, not in the sky, but within the walls of the palace. Corporal Thomas Reed, a royal guard of 10 years, had been summoned before the palace council that morning. Rumors swirled like smoke. He had spoken against an unfair order, refused to follow a command that went against his honor. To the palace officials, it was defiance. To Thomas, it was duty. He stood in his red coat, his tall bearskin hat shadowing his eyes. 2 men in black suits flanked him, holding his arms as if he were a criminal. His medals gleamed on his chest, symbols of loyalty, now used as evidence against him. The youngest princess, barely 9, had overheard whispers through the marble corridors. Her governess had told her to stay in her chambers. This is no matter for a child. But Charlotte had always been different. Curious, bold, with a sense of right and wrong that sometimes made the adults uncomfortable. She slipped away, her small feet silent on the polished floor. The echoes of her lineage, the power of queens and kings, seemed to follow her down every hall. When she reached the courtyard, the hearing was already underway. An official in a dark suit was reading from a sheet. "Corporal Thomas Reed, for insubordination and breach of royal protocol, you are hereby dismissed from Her Majesty's service effective immediately." But before the final words could fall, Charlotte's voice sliced through the air. "You can't dismiss a man for telling the truth." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The guard stiffened. The officials froze. Thomas looked up, disbelief flickering in his eyes. The princess, the future of the crown itself, was standing before him, her small hands clenched at her sides, her face fierce with defiance. "Your Highness," one of the men began, lowering his head nervously. "This is an internal matter." "No," Charlotte interrupted. "This is my guard. He protects our family. And if he's punished for being honest, then what are we protecting?" The question hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The official's face reddened. "Princess, you don't understand the complexities." "I understand loyalty," she shot back. "And I understand fear. One builds kingdoms. The other destroys them." Her words didn't sound rehearsed. They were raw, instinctive, the kind that make grown men look down at their shoes in shame. Thomas tried to speak. "Your Highness, please, you don't need to." But she shook her head. "You stood when others bowed to lies. You're not the one who should be leaving." The courtyard seemed to breathe for the first time. The wind lifted the edge of her velvet cloak, sunlight glinted off the gold thread, and for a fleeting moment, even the statues looked alive, watching history unfold in real time. Thomas had refused to alter a report, a detail the palace preferred to keep hidden. A royal carriage had nearly caused an accident outside the palace gates, and instead of blaming a civilian, Thomas had written the truth. The driver was at fault. It was a small act of honesty, but in a world ruled by image, it was rebellion. The officials wanted it gone, but Thomas had refused. "My oath was to the crown, not its comfort," he'd said. And now, that truth had brought him here, to the edge of disgrace. But the princess's stand changed everything. The head official turned pale. "Your Highness, we must follow protocol." Charlotte raised her chin. "Then change it. Because if our laws can't protect the honest, they don't deserve to rule." For a child, her voice held the gravity of a monarch. Around her, the guards' faces softened. They weren't statues anymore. They were witnesses. One by one, the soldiers began to shift their stance, subtle but unified. In that silent show of respect, the officials realized they were outnumbered not by force, but by conviction. Later that evening, when the palace halls were quiet and the echo of conflict had faded, Thomas stood at his post once more. He felt the familiar weight of his hat, the stiffness of his uniform. But now, something had changed. From the upper balcony, Charlotte appeared again, dressed in her nightgown, holding a cup of cocoa. She waved at him with a smile only a child could give, innocent yet knowing. Thomas bowed his head deeply, emotion catching in his throat. He had stood against power before, but never had power stood for him. He whispered softly to himself, "God save the princess." Days later, word spread quietly among the staff and guards. The report had been reinstated, unaltered. Thomas's record was cleared, and in the private corridors of the palace, it was said that the queen herself had smiled when she read Charlotte's handwritten note on the matter. If the truth makes us uncomfortable, then it's time we grew stronger, not quieter. And so the palace returned to its rhythm, guards marching, tourists watching, life moving forward. But in the hearts of those who had witnessed that morning's defiance, something had changed. Because courage, it turns out, doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes, it wears a small, trembling voice in a child who refuses to look away. When asked about it years later, Thomas never spoke much. He would only smile and say, "Loyalty isn't about silence. It's about standing tall, even when the ground shakes beneath you." Sometimes, the smallest voice can echo louder than the mightiest crown. If this story touched you, subscribe and share it with someone who still believes in courage.